Okay, good morning, everybody. We're just going to give it 1 minute and then we're going to kick off. Officer Goodwin is stood in the wings, ready to make an appearance. So we are just going to give it 60 seconds and then we will get started. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to bring Officer G. Officer Goodwin is going to come into the mix. Your volume should be up. Okay, he's playing difficult today.
I'm here and I'm with you.
Perfect, excellent. Officer Goodwin, would you like to take a step into reception? So good morning,
everyone.
There he goes. So good morning. Hopefully you should all be able to hear us nice and loud and clear. I've not done a sound test today because this is, I think, our third week back in doing these lives, and I'm that confident that we've got everything correct. I've not even done a test, so I'm sure someone will tell me in a second if they can't hear me. We are coming banging out the blocks today, I would say. We are coming literally racing out of the blocks. It is the end of lockdown. We're into our different tiers. I appreciate some people are going to be there in tier 2, like ourselves here in Shrewsbury and like our team down in Shepton Mallet. I appreciate there will be some people in tier 3, and that's going to be a little bit tougher for you. And obviously we want to send out our support, don't we, for tier 3s, because I know it's going to be a lot harder for you. And to all the businesses and such like that. But we are coming flying out the box at both of our prisons. I've spoken to both the sites today. I know Shepton Mallet's open. I know there's people in wandering around investigating ghosts already. There's people having self-guided tours, guided tours happening later today. I know there's ghost tours as well happening down at Shepton Mallet prison. Shrewsbury prison, a similar kind of thing. The big gates opened this morning at 10 o'clock. Self-guiders were straight through the door. We've got guided tours happening later, which are run by yourself.
This afternoon, yes. Looking forward to getting back in contact with people.
And we've got the evening tours going again, so the ghost tours and the lights out tours and stuff like that. So both prisons are coming flying out the blocks, which is fantastic. Both are looking really good. They've had some redecoration done in both the prisons, a little bit of maintenance done during the lockdown. So lots and lots has been happening behind the scenes, and we're really looking forward to sharing that with you. On top of that, I'm gonna put this one out there right now. I have had the team set up Officer Goodwin with his own social media accounts. I know, it's a big step, but Officer Goodwin now has his own public social media accounts where you can follow him. So he is now on Facebook as a page, he's on Instagram, he's on Twitter. You can find him at Officer G Goodwin. That's Officer G Goodwin, and I'm going to look to Harriet right now. She's going to post it up there. So if you just look on any of the social media platforms, Officer G Goodwin, and you will find Officer Goodwin himself. Give him a like, give him a follow, send him some love, and again, he'll be live, obviously, on his own channel doing these lives. You are live today on your own channel.
What can I say?
These the other thing that we actually have happening here today is in Shrewsbury prison today, sorry, I should say, is that we have the drug dogs in from Berwyn. So they come in and do training with the drug dogs. They have assessments next week, I believe. So they're in all day today. So if you do visit Shrewsbury, you'll be able to see them. And I think that probably leads us in really nicely with today's subject, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's going to be all about drugs and substances, drugs. Well, the problems it causes and the way we try to combat it and what we do to combat those problems in prisons.
Well, look, should we get started with that? I'm going to get you just to take a slight step to your right, Officer G, just half a step to your right. Yeah, half a step more. Perfect, absolutely perfect. I can see you nice and clearly there on the screen. And you know, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to throw it straight over to you. I know it's a big day today. I said there's lots of firsts happening, so I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to let you take over. So it's all yours, Officer G.
Yeah, we're going to talk about drugs today, and obviously I fully expect that it's really quite an emotive subject. There are lots of views around the place about decriminalisation and why people get involved in drugs and should they serve longer sentences and which drugs should be taken off the legal statute books and which should be put on and all that. However, we won't get too involved in that today. We're going to talk about the practicalities of drugs, particularly in prisons, the problems it causes, and the way we try to combat it and deal with it. But it'd be fair for me to start off by saying the reality is that if you think about this country or the world generally, but certainly this country, drugs, what are they? What do they do? How do you define what a drug is? And they say a definition of a drug is basically any substance that you put into your body that has changes a physical nature of your body or has a physical reaction to your body and or a psychological one, or possibly both. And the reality is we're all introduced to drugs relatively at a young age. For all of us when we were young and we had problems like headaches and coughs and colds, when you think about things as simple as Aspros and aspirins and ibuprofen, they're all drugs that have a reaction to the body. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many drugs that are given out by doctors and they're great. They're there to help people, to keep them safe, to keep them well, and hopefully help them sort of possibly cure them so they don't have to take drugs again. And that's all about the legal drugs and the way they're controlled through the medical healthcare system. So they're controlled to that degree. But even legal drugs can cause problems. You can take too many aspirin, and that can be extremely dangerous, if not lethal, if you take too much. We can talk about things like alcohol. A lot of people don't consider alcohol to be a drug, but it is a drug, simply because it has a reaction to the body with everybody, and everybody reacts differently, as we know. I've known happy drunks in my time, and I've known people be extremely violent just on having a couple of drinks and all those issues, not counting all the illnesses that come from alcohol-related problems. When you think of liver conditions and stomach and bowels, all those things may be causatory by alcohol and stuff like that. Smoking cigarettes, it's a perfectly legal thing to do within limitations these days, of course, but it has an effect on the body. It has an addictive quality to it as well. So those legal drugs that we've got and all the things we can buy over the pharmacy and such like that. But I'm going to move on now a little bit to those drugs that are classified as illegal drugs. And all the problems that come through it, particularly in prisons. You'll see just behind me now, I'm standing in the reception room. And the reception room basically is the first point of contact that we have with a prisoner that may be coming in with some drug issues. Now, some of the men are coming in and they've been down to the in the police cells for a number of days, and they would have had some medical intervention. And it's a matter for us just to find out where we are with that, or the healthcare and staff, and then move on from that point. There are going to be some prisoners coming in that might have only been in police cells for just over a day, and they haven't had any real medical intervention. So they may be coming off the vehicles into our reception room, not in the best frame of mind and not in the best physical state either. But this is the point that we'll have to establish and deal with those situations. They'll be interviewed by the nurse, who will then be looking at whether they need to go onto detox programs and other interventions. And we'll be talking to prisoners as well on what they call the first night officer cell sharing risk assessment. So we balance up how we may be placing prisoners in their cells depending on their particular problems and issues and stuff like that. So yeah, that starts off. So some prisoners are going to go on to detox. Not all of them go on to detox. It's not compulsory. You can't force any prisoner to take any medication they don't want, just like the rest of us in society. But many of them do take the detox program. And they go into prisons like that. Now, you've got all kinds of drugs in prison. You've got some really serious drugs, the heroin, the cocaine, the crack. The popular drugs at the moment are things like spice, mamba, and monkey dust. They're all sort of basically man-made substances, and they're highly volatile drugs. So it's really difficult to know if there's any particular one reaction that one person, and that can cause us huge amounts of problems. And so how do they get through a door? Well, here we are in reception. The first point of reception is there's going to be a prisoner going to go through a process, and somewhere through that process, they're going to be strip searched. All their possessions will be taken off them if they brought any with them. They will be strip searched. And also in another little bay, we have a thing called a BOSS chair. A BOSS chair is a body orifice searching scanner.
And sorry, we now have one.
Yes.
I'm really pleased we do. We now actually have one at Shrewsbury Prison. Yeah. Lauren, the site manager here, organised getting a boss chair. So just, actually, you could point to it for me, Officer Goodwin. Just if you point to your right hand, stick your right hand out.
It's just up there in a little bay.
It's you could, yeah, go on, you go for a wander, you can go in, you can see it, that's it.
It's keep just going, in there.
Keep going, yeah.
Okay. Is that good?
I love watching you do this. Sorry.
See, I can move.
We do have one so people can come and actually see what a boss chair looks like.
Yeah.
So.
They are what they are. They're designed, normally prisoners will sit on them. So there are more sophisticated ones around as well that not only check if you've got anything hidden up your backside, but it can also check inside stomachs. It can check inside underneath through the chin, underneath the neck there. It can even check underneath the plates of the feet or into the back of the legs as well. So there are more sophisticated ones around than the one that we've got, but either way. So they're there to give us an indication of whether we need to be looking further into that, whether the prisoners are carrying stuff inside them. I don't want to go into too much detail about how these things come in the jail, but when I said it's a boss chair and you sit on it and there's a detector underneath your bum, it will give you a good indication of the kind of stuff that may be coming in. And it's not just drugs, but other stuff, but we're concentrating on drugs today. Somebody said, well, what happens if you find them or you get a detection? Well, that prisoner will be isolated in a cell then until such time as those drugs have been passed. And they will be watched and hopefully they're going to pass them, and then we'll deal with that situation as we go along. So basically that's the reception part of it and stuff like that. You must remember that drugs are coming in all kinds of different ways into prisons. Not only do they try to bring it in through reception, you're going to have some families, friends and associates of prisoners who are coming to visit who will also be hiding this stuff inside their bodies, bringing it into the visiting area, and they pass through the searching areas, and if they can go to the toilet, which they're allowed to do, they may be retrieving this stuff, trying to bring it back into the visits room and then hand it over to the prisoner one way or another. So there are families and friends we have to watch. There is a risk, and it's a small risk, fortunately, but there is a small element of corruption amongst some of the staff, not just prison officers. It may be nurses, it may be teachers, it may be civilian staff, but there is a small element of corruption amongst staff who for all kinds of different reasons, whether they're willing participants, whether they've been blackmailed, all kinds of issues going on where they may be bringing drugs into a jail. They are particularly difficult for us to manage simply because we trust prison officers particularly, and all staff, because we give them a set of keys and we trust them to walk around the prison so you can see. There are staff searches that take place every so often within the prison, so staff will be searched thoroughly. Now, if you're going to a high security prison, somewhere like Belmarsh, you'll find that you've got airport security literally all the time. So even just going into work, governors, officers, civilian staff will pass through airport security where your bags are x-rayed, you've got to take your belts and your shoes off, you'll be going through the old archways coming through, you may be wanted by an officer, searched if there's any suspicion, taken away and given another search and all that. And that will happen with all the visitors that are coming into a prison, particularly in high security prisons as well. Now, they are bringing out, and there is a number now, of body scanners. Body scanners are far more efficient for obvious reasons. They can actually stand there and you can actually see what's inside people's bodies, not just inside the back cavity. You can also see if they're carrying anything within their stomachs. It's not unusual for them to swallow this stuff, wrap it up in protective material. It's high risk when you swallow stuff because acid in the stomach is extremely powerful and it will eat through stuff within reasonable time. So there have been one or two prisoners we've had in reception where we've had to have the old Nino lights coming through.
I was going to say it's not
lights.
common for them to OD, is it?
Yeah.
Normally, obviously, put it into, I think historically it would wrap it in cling film or condoms and then swallow it. But now, actually, I'm led to believe that people are using things like they'll wrap it in cling film and such, but they'll also put it inside the Kinder Egg cartons inside. So inside a Kinder Egg, you get your toy, don't you, inside?
That's usually for what they call anal insertion.
Yeah.
There's always a standing joke like pop, 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 in they go and pop, 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 out they come. Because a prisoner once was caught with 5 of them up. Not here, it was in another prison, of course. So yeah, there are all those issues that are going to be managed and looked at.
Before we jump on, because I know I certainly would like to hear it. I know other people will want to hear it. I'm sure is about the drugs of choice over the decades and how those have changed. But somebody's just asked, actually, there's been a couple of comments. Somebody has said, Laura said that she's in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction and has been clean and sober for 5 years and 6 months, which is a huge effort. So
well done. Yeah, it is a choice. When I first joined the service way back in the 70s, the kind of drugs that you see running around the streets and in prison today just really didn't exist. In prisons, cannabis was really quite popular if they could get it in. There was nowhere near the problem with drugs in prisons then as there is now. And there may have been other things like uppers and downers were popular in the 60s and 70s, barbiturates and those kind of drugs. There would have been other drugs, but you must remember things like crack and cocaine and heroin were not really overly popular on the streets at that time. It's only when they got mass produced and got mixed up with all the rubbish that's put into them, pushed down onto the streets, that basically it spread around the place, the addiction spread, and then crime results for many people to get addicted simply because they're not like, you hear about the rock stars that are taking the drugs. The thing is, they can afford them. Not only that, they can also afford the rehab. The reality is that many people that have just come from a normal working life, they end up committing crime to feed their addiction. So not all people that come to prison are generally what you call, not all criminals are drug takers or drug addicted, and not all people that are drug addiction are criminals. What happens is they get themselves caught up with an addiction, and then they end up committing crime to feed that addiction.
I should say it's things like theft. It's whatever you need to do to get money to get drugs, or whatever you need to get drugs.
Oh, they'll take it off their own families.
Yeah, exactly.
They'll steal it off their own families before they steal it off someone else, because they'll take the easy option and stuff like that. I've had many prisoners come to jail and they've got themselves cleaned up while they're in prison, and they are different people altogether. They really, really are. They come in and they'll talk to you and be quite honest and say, I can't actually believe that I did those things to my family, or I committed those crimes. It's not me. It's not something I do, but they get caught. And sadly today, they're getting caught up at a much younger age as well. I remember some years ago doing a drug addiction sort of group therapy stuff with a bunch of prisoners, about 8 of us sitting around, and we sort of did the round robin as you go around, introducing themselves, telling them when they first took drugs, how they got into it, and all those kind of things. And we got round to one guy there, and he said, well, in actual fact, he said, I was 12 years old and my mother introduced me to drugs, and it was heroin. And he ended up being her runner to fetch the drugs for her because she was a heroin addict. And the reality is, the thinking then was, as it somewhat is today, that if you use younger people like children, 10, 11, 12, to do your running for you, they're less likely to come to the notice of police. That's the reality of the situation. And obviously, you can't just take people up and throw them in jail when they're 10. So this is one of those reasons.
Used to.
They used to.
Used to.
Yeah, there was no age of criminality for many years. No, so you can see the complications with that. So it's really quite a complicated situation. I've known some prisoners come into jail and they're glad to be here. And they've said to me, you know, Mr. J, I'm glad I'm here, because if I hadn't come into prison today, I'd have probably been dead within the next 2 weeks. Now, that's going back some years ago when there wasn't quite so many drugs running around the jail, so it might have been easier for them to resist. Shrewsbury has always had a pretty good reputation, or a very good reputation, when it comes to drugs within our prisons. We're a small prison. Being smaller prisons, I think it's easier. You get to know your prisoners, you get to know what's going on in a jail a lot easier, and it may be somewhat easier to be able to manage. You don't get the same kind of gang elements operating in smaller prisons that you do in big ones, because once the gangs get operating, drugs are very lucrative in prisons financially, and you may find the gangs are now competing with each other to take control. When you get to that situation in a prison where the drugs are being pushed by prisoners, you're going to get debt with some prisoners, because if you're addicted, you'll take the drug and worry about paying for it after the event. And then some get to that point where they can't pay for it after the event. So, and the gangs are vying with each other. So violence increases dramatically over the drug that running around prisons. It really is, you know. The other ways that it comes in, I just want to finish that part off, is we've gone through that. You've got it been thrown over fences. Depending on the prison you're in, of course, it's easier to throw it over the fences. There are some very big prisons. They may be category C, so the security isn't so high. They've got football pitches, rugby pitches, big areas outside, grassed areas, where things may be thrown over the fence, where prisoners may have access to pick it up. Smaller jails like Shrewsbury, never a problem. We had a sterile area that went right around the prison, and basically prisoners never went in that area unless they were going with a member of staff, and that was usually just to go and clean the area.
But the exercise yard is very close to the wall though, and it's a very low wall, so throwing something over the wall into the exercise yard would be quite simple at Shrewsbury.
Well, our yards, as most yards are in prisons now, they're fenced in. So they basically have a fenced in yard. It's really probably at least 2 stories high. It'll have razor wire running across the top of it, and it will also be, we used to net ours up at an angle going up to the roof space. So anything thrown over the wall would be rolling off down into the sterile area. That's not true of all prisons, because it's not that easily. It's easy for us to do because we're, say, a relatively small exercise yard, stuff like that. Now, I remember a time when I first joined the service, prisoners had never had fenced in exercise yard. We used to literally walk them around in circles just inside the corner of the wall.
Yeah.
And many prisons did that. That I was in Gloucester prison, they just walked around. So there was no fencing, no netting, nothing at all. No.
And I've put up Shepton. We've taken you to Shepton Mallet Prison. Officer Goodwin here. That is the only fence. The fence you can see there behind Officer Goodwin is the only fence in the exercise yard of Shepton Mallet Prison. Yeah. The reason behind that is because it is surrounded by 4 walls of the wings inside, so it's 3 stories high in that yard.
And then the 4 walls are running around.
And then the 4 walls, and the wall just Officer Goodwin's left. If he pokes with his left hand, that's your right hand.
Where do you want?
Your left hand.
Where do you want to go there?
Yeah, that way. Yeah, that wall there, that is A wing. So that's A wing. Everything's reversed, remember? So that's A wing. And that wall is 75 foot high for a start. And you've actually got to get over 75 foot high wall, but then you've got to clear the entire wing itself. Yeah. And then drop it into the exercise yard. So it doesn't really happen.
And you've got to hope that the prisoners are actually out on the yard at the time you do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it doesn't hit an officer in the back of the head or something along those lines. Let me jump back, because I want to pick this one up, because I think this is really important information. It shows how prisons have changed over the time. And in a second, I'm just going to give everyone a very quick warning. In a second, we are going to show some images of different drugs. There's no drug taking, but we are going to show some images of different drugs. We're also going to show an image of a couple of people that have taken drugs, taken spice specifically, and they don't look in the best state. So I'm just giving you a quick warning that will come up in a second. 1970s, drug of choice in prison?
It would have been, cannabis would have been quite popular. Hooch was more popular. Hooch is basically where they're making their own alcohol by using fruit and sugar, and if they can steal a little bit of yeast out of the kitchen, because we used to make all our own breads and stuff like that, they would. So they were quite common, not as common today, but it still exists. I've no doubt there are prisons out there now that are brewing up ready for Christmas.
Would you say
the problem is it's got a very high smell rate? So I was going to say,
would you say, because with cannabis normally it's smoked as well, so you would have been able to smell that throughout the wings. So therefore, would you say that it would have been easier, more likely to be detected?
Well, one of the things that I found, obviously you go into the 70s, 80s, probably sometimes through the early 90s as well, is that very often with these kind of drugs, prisoners would very often wait until they were what they call banged up, locked up at night time, before they started to dip into those drugs. So you could smell it when you were walking around all night. You'd get that smell and you go, hang on a sec, that's a bit familiar. And so you know what was going on your landing. Now, before anybody says that staff should be diving into a cell to go and stop it happening during the night, I have to remind you, on a wing of 350 prisoners, there were only 2 staff on that wing during the night. There just isn't the staff to go breaking into cells and dealing. We'll try to deal with that the next day when the day staff come on.
I'm guessing prisoners are relatively sharp to this as well. If suddenly a door starts opening for their cell, that joint's going to go down a toilet or out a window. Don't know what you're talking about, boss. Must be the guy next door.
We can put them on tests the next day, and then these days that test will tell us, because particularly with cannabis and stuff, it stays in the system for up to 30 days, which is not true of things like spice and mamba. It has a much shorter time of stopping in the body. And the reality with that is it maybe then become today a drug of choice, because they can get away with it for 3 days, go for a drug test and it doesn't show. So there are risks with that. But
Moving into the 80s, obviously still cannabis will still be prevalent inside prisons, and obviously alcohol and tobacco as well. Tobacco we never see as a drug.
They could buy tobacco, but it was also dealt with as well.
Moving to the 80s, I assume we're going to see more cocaine floating around in the prisons.
There was to a degree. It increased. It's like all things. It increases proportionately with how it increases on the streets. Whatever you see going on the street is relatively a reflection of what may be going on in prisons. I said, but you're in a closed environment now. But yeah, there would be different stuff coming through the doors, all that. Like I said, we move on through the 90s, certainly in the 2000s, the noughties and later on. Spice, Mamba, Monkey Dust are probably some of the most popular things that can come through the door, of course. So what are you showing? There's that cannabis you're showing.
That is cannabis, yeah. They've conveniently labelled it spice for me, but I'm pretty sure that that's not spice and it's cannabis just because of the way it's being rolled.
Very often with spice, it's a synthetic drug. They'll mix it up with a plant-based material, which won't be tobacco because tobacco is expensive to buy. So why would you spend money to wrap it up in something like that?
And I know this is done, I know drugs are taken in a very different way in prison now from a video you and I did previously and through the restrictions in alcohol, restrictions in tobacco, sorry, we'll come on to that in a second. So moving into the 90s, my assumption is that the ecstasy will have made an appearance, and also heroin would have started becoming a lot more prevalent.
They will be around the place, yeah, because obviously one of the big things is about syringes, finding syringes.
I was going to ask that. How?
Well, they may come in once again, obviously sealed up, and come up somebody's backside, or get passed in, or brought in by a corrupt member of staff. It's so difficult.
Stolen from healthcare?
Sorry?
Will they get stolen from healthcare?
That would be pretty rare, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's impossible because I don't know, but that depends on how keen the staff are. But I would imagine the staff there are very, very careful about how syringes are operated in.
What about things like sharing syringes? Is that going to happen?
Well, that would happen. It happens out on the streets.
Oh no, obviously it does, but it's a lot easier. You can just go and buy syringes when you're outside. You can go to the pharmacies and such and buy syringes. But it's in prisons, if you can't get hold of them, I suppose it's the risk that people will share.
Oh, it wouldn't be unusual. They're not going to be sitting there all actually using individual ones. They would be sharing. One would hope that they would try to sterilize and keep it clean, because that's the huge problem, of course, with passing such things like hepatitis, or if anybody happens to be HIV positive as well, once it's going back into the bloodstream, you can see the problem with that. But so there are occasional times when you see syringes around.
And then as we've said, moving into 2000, and certainly now where we are in the sort of the 2010 to 2020 era, and what's going to be the next decade coming forwards, we're finding, or prisons are finding, that things like spice and mamba are now a lot more readily available, and they're probably more the drug of choice in prisons. I'm saying kind of
what's that?
Cautiously. Spice and mamba. Yeah, is that going to be?
It seems to be the biggest one. There's all kinds of reasons why that be. First of all, it can come in small packages, so it's easier to smuggle through the doors. Secondly, it may not be sitting in the body so long, so there's less risk of prisoners being caught under the influence of those drugs.
It's cheaper, isn't it?
Sorry?
I believe it's cheaper as well.
It's not going to become a high cost. Remember, it's synthetic, so you can just make it and mix it up and cut it and put all kinds of other rubbish with it. And the problem with taking any drug that's illegal, you never know the quality of what you're taking or the quantity, because every one you take is basically a lottery at the end of the day. And some people can take it 10 times and go, hey, give it to their mates, have a try of that, mate. And they go, oh, no, go on, it's all right, I take it all the time. They take it once and they're dead. You just don't know. Or you can take it 10 times and 11 times, it's just not the stuff that you thought you could be taking, and you're dead. Remember, ODing is much more common in prisons now than it ever was. Prisoners generally might take drugs while the doors are open rather than wait until they're closed at night time. And one of those reasons that was suggested to me, which makes a lot of sense some time ago, if the doors are open and they OD, there's going to be staff around and prisoners around that will notice that and get the medical attention. If they're behind their doors at night time and they take this drug and zonk out, they may not be waking up the next morning, and nobody is going to know until the next morning, until the doors are unlocked. And you find that one or both of those prisoners may have had a real bad batch. So, because not in Shrewsbury, I think Shrewsbury was very good. There was a slightly higher problem with drugs when I was on another prison. I won't mention it, but the other prison I went to after this closed for a short while, couple of years, drugs were much more prevalent on the wings you could see prisoners walking around and knew quite easily they were under the influence of some substance.
Yeah, I've got a picture here. Actually, I'll get you to stand one way or the other, Officer G. Keep going for me.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
So this is obviously taken out in the streets. It is two people that have taken spice and basically are zombied out, and that's what it's referred to, isn't it? As the zombie drug. Is it does literally knock you out to this extent. And there's a video. There's a video that we did on YouTube. I'll get the link and I'll post it up in a second. That Officer G and I did where we watched a video that was taken inside a prison. Prisoners filmed it on a phone that was illegally taken in of other prisoners taking spice for the first time. And we watched that, didn't we? We had a conversation about that and the realities of what that's like. So drug taking in prison.
You must remember in prisons as well that it's not unusual if a new batch of drugs are coming in, that they'll actually test it out on somebody else because they don't know what they're selling either. And they have to be very careful about what they're giving out around the place. And I've known them to encourage people that may not be quite so good at resisting it or just caught up in the drugs and they might be struggling with educational needs or learning behavior needs and stuff like that, who would be more likely to convince to take this stuff, and they'll stand back and watch to see what's happening. And then, and it's all a bit of fun, which they'll video as well, of course, and get them on video. And that's probably the classic case of that video that you showed there. Oddly enough, when they're in that state, obviously, as you can well imagine, they aren't a problem.
Yeah.
They're not, other than for themselves possibly ODing and needing serious medical attention, they're not a problem. The problem always comes with many of these drugs that put people down and under like that. Heroin's a classic example of stuff like that, is when they're coming out of that drug and they're coming up back into the real world and the withdrawal systems start to kick in. And that obviously, the longer that goes on, the greater the withdrawal system is going to affect them, the more desperate they become to get drugs. And then that makes them the more desperate they are when they're committing crime and quite brazenly sometimes when they're going into shops or even knocking people down on the side of the streets to rob them and stuff like that. So, you can see now there are other drugs that don't react like that. When you think of things like cocaine, that's going to have the opposite effect. Cocaine doesn't put people under, it really wakes them up. And that's when they become overconfident. They feel like they're Superman. They're running around the place. They're thinking much faster. It's all power. It's all power. So you can see, and that means that they may be serious risk takers then, and also get involved in things that are harmful, not to themselves, but to everybody else. Imagine driving a car. I'm brilliant. I can drive a car at any speed and I'm safe. So you can see that there's different drugs have different reactions, obviously, to people.
And people have certainly this image. I thought it probably would drive some comments and responses, and it has people talking about the areas that they live in, as Wrexham, as Stoke, and stuff like this. That people are saying, "Have you seen these areas?" That we see these people around all the time, and we see them in Shrewsbury as well, just outside the prison, across the bridge between us and the town, the Dada Bridge, and quite regularly there'll be people there that are in a really bad state. We don't actually get it in Shepton Mallet particularly, but that's because it's a much smaller town in a very different type of area. So it is different, but let's move on. So people come to prison, obviously they will have people that come with drug addictions and such. I think it's important we do remember that drug addictions they're an illness. There is an element of choice to begin with, just as there is with alcoholism, but then it's a sickness, it is an illness. But they come to prison with a drug addiction, and then they will have an option of programs, won't they? So can you take us through the healthcare options?
Yeah, you can see, I mean, when you look at why people take drugs, it's many and complex reasons. Some people, as they're growing up, have problems with depression and all that, and they think that taking some drug will be useful. It probably does help them initially. You've got people that want to experiment. You get people that are led by their friends. Their friends have dumped into it and taken it. It's peer pressure. They want to be part of the group.
Various reasons why people get into it, and there's a difference between recreational and dabbling and trying to a full-blown addiction, and that's the same with alcohol. You and I both like to go out and have a drink every now and again. We can't go out and drink now, but we'll sit at home. We both drink the same sort of stuff as well, but not to the extent where we have to do it constantly. And I won't get too much into it now, but certainly with alcoholism, there's a big piece around. It's
a huge problem.
The idea of alcoholism, or the theory is that an alcoholic only has the choice on the first drink. You're making a choice of whether you're going to have the first drink or the first sip.
After that,
you have no choice.
Yeah. But the reality with alcohol is it's responsible for the majority of violent crimes that take place in society.
Yeah.
You'll find there's alcohol sitting behind it, and we probably all, particularly the adults in here, we've been in some pubs, not all pubs, but I've been around over the years. I've been in pubs and I've seen people getting up and they're having a punch up. And serious punch-ups going on in the pub, or they're outside the bars. We've all been around the towns at night where there's men and women all wanting to scrap, and it's nearly all alcohol-based. There may be some drug-based in there, but a lot of it's alcohol-based when you get in there.
And alcohol tends to just bring out the real person.
But they always say there's an underlying issue going on, because some people are happy drunks and others aren't. And you go, why would that be? Why can some people drink and just be happy drunks and go to sleep, and other ones just literally want to argue every single word and then possibly start to get threatening and violent?
Let's, because as always, we could stay at these conversations for hours and hours and hours. So we've got about 10, 11 minutes left. So let's talk about healthcare. So you come to prison with a drug problem. You can take a step slightly further that way if you want to. Perfect. You come to prison with a drug problem. I know, I'm not assuming. It used to be a case of there was one type of program, which was cold turkey. When I point at you, that's your cue.
I'm not always looking at you, but doing your rattle. Prisoners very often called it doing your rattle. And to be honest with you, they got nothing. They did cold turkey. Yes, the doctor would come in the evening. We would sort of keep them downstairs on the ones in a couple of cells by the office to keep an eye on them. And they would give them something pretty basic to help them through the shakes and vomiting and all the usual things that they go through withdrawal. But it wasn't very much. And they did struggle. And they struggled anywhere from 5 to 10 days to get this stuff out of your system. But then normally they'd come round and they'd start wanted to get something to eat, and they'd start to have a shower, start to come out of their cells, and then end up going back to going to work, getting into the gym. And sometimes over 6 months, you'd see these guys coming in 6 stone wringing wet. And then in 6 months' time, they're 14 stone with muscles and really fit and healthy. And sadly, many of them go out and they get caught up in the world that they came from, and literally they'll go on that cycle, and you'll see them on the roundabout coming in and out of jail well over the time. The gate that you see behind there, this is when we moved on, probably some 20 years ago.
I was going to say, when is it cold? Because cold turkey was the only option.
There was no other options.
So from historically, all the way back to Georgian times when there would be opioids and stuff like that. So
well, technically they weren't illegal opium in those days, were they?
All the way through to what year was it that drug programs entered jails?
Yeah, I think it was just on about 20 years ago that we brought in what they call the detox programs at different levels for different people. It all happens, prisoners go behind that gate, and there's a wooden door that would be shut behind them, and they would literally be sitting there, and the drug counselors and the drug nurses will be issuing out, unless they've changed it, they only issue out one or another of a drug, and that was either subutex or methadone. And that was obviously, there's your methadone, and therefore it was a controlled amount. They would sit in that room for a number of minutes after. Sometimes they'd be given a drink, but the idea behind the nurses was to make sure the prisoner wasn't trying to hold it into their mouth in some way, to make sure the stuff had gone down their throats and had actually been absorbed.
And it's just before you jump, because I'm looking at all the different images, and one thing that really strikes me is just, because I know subutex and methadone aren't quite a heroin, but the idea that you'd put this into your body and all the risks that come along with it compared to what effectively looks like cough syrup.
Yes. Yeah. I think it looks like Benylin, if I remember right. Benylin used to be a powerful, quite a powerful cough mixture.
And subutex looks more like paracetamol.
It does, yeah. But that's the way that they deal with it now. They put the prisoners on these, one or the other of these programs. They don't have the both of them, of course. And every so often they will be drug tested, because there are some prisoners that will be using this and still accessing other drugs up on the landings. And now, obviously, I assume that if the drug counselors and the drug nurses find out that they've been abusing it, they may be losing their detox programs. But that's, I don't get really involved in that, because it's mostly done by drugs nurses that are not basically prison officers, the drugs counselors, drug nurse professionals in their own right that deal with this. We also have a voluntary scheme that runs in prisons as well, where prisoners can come and volunteer to go on the testing program, and we'll call them down. We don't tell them when we're calling them. They can't nominate when they want to be tested. We go, we'll put you on the list. We're going to come and surprise you. And that's the idea behind it. and we'll give them a little certificate every time their body comes up clean, just to let them know where they are. And for some prisoners that's successful. For others, they don't, they lose that and they don't survive that. And we also do drug testing, which is mandatory drug testing, which is a different thing. Every month the computer will spit up X amount of names, and those names then over the next couple of weeks will be taken into the MDT, the Mandatory Drug Treatment Centre, and they will be giving us urine samples. Those are sent off to be tested. If they're positive, outside magistrates come back in to deal with the prisoner's charge and their possible punishment that may be coming their way.
Let me ask you a question. This is going to be a difficult one for you, and I know that these are the ones that you avoid answering on guided tours because they create so much discussion. On guided tours, you're very much in a position of talking about the realities rather than giving necessarily your opinions directly. I know people can take you down to the restaurant afterwards for tea, coffee, and cake. And
I know where you're going with this, mate. I know where you're going with this.
Okay, cool. So we've got cold turkey. We've got a drug program. Which is better?
Well, it's difficult to know that, but I do know that cold turkey was effective. Whether we like it or not, whether we think it's fair or whether we think it's cruel, is sort of immaterial to that point. The reality is that when we had our cold turkey year, and I imagine there may be ex-officers or officers listening to this now, it never failed. Yeah, it never failed. No one ever died going through the cold turkey when they were in prisons under that scheme. And basically it cost nothing either. You have to appreciate it costs very, very little to put somebody through cold turkey. You have to appreciate with the detox programs, they are very, very, very expensive issues, but I'm not there to judge what's right and wrong. The prison service have decided that's the right and reasonable way to deal with this issue. And that's the system that we've operated. So it's no detriment to the staff that work there, the professional people that work under the criteria that they're given, of course. But no, so cold turkey, yes, it was effective. I've had prisoners come up to me over the time when they brought out detox on the land and said, you know, boss, I'd actually preferred it when it was at, yeah, do your rattle and cold turkey. And I should say, honestly, that surprises me that, you know, you've got the detox. He said, yeah, but the trouble is, he says, boss, you can get hooked up on this detox and you get reliant on it and you don't really want to be coming off the damn stuff. And he said, at least with the 10-day, when we had no choice, you didn't have any choice. You were in that cell for 7 to 10 days and then you were clean. And then they say, I don't promise you that I won't take drugs while I'm in the jail. However, I'm clean at that time and you've done your bit. Now it's down to me. And that's the idea. I mean, a lot of people's view is once we've cleaned somebody up, you go, when do you hand the responsibility back to someone and go, we've done what we think is reasonable to get you off this drug and clean you up. Now you have to step forward and take some responsibility for that action. Because, and I know it's not easy because addictions are very powerful things, of course.
Absolutely. But it's a human rights issue, isn't it? Am I right in understanding? That's where it's all stemmed from, is the idea that, well, no, it's cruel to put somebody through this photally, mentally. It is cruel to put somebody through cold turkey, and actually we should be supporting them in a different way and a drug programs. Yeah. So, but I totally
just to finish off with that, one of the issues that I did notice, obviously I've stood there when there's prisoners going in to get their detox programs, and they come in and they do their detox and they get out perhaps 4, 5, 6 months, a bit later, a bit longer, and then literally within months I'll see them standing in the queue again. And I've actually said to them, remember, I know some of these prisoners really well because I've known them for years, and I go, hey, already back, what happened there? And they'll shrug their shoulders, go, what do you know, boss? And I go, no, I don't know. I don't know. But I can understand when they get out, how this can go wrong for them. Some prisoners might have been serving a time, they're struggling to fit back into their family, they can't get a job, finance is difficult, having to deal with children again when they didn't have to do it is difficult. They're back out with their friends who might still be using drugs, and basically nobody wants to be seen as the outsider in any group. Their heads might go down a bit, and then, just this once then. And then next week it's just this once, and then tomorrow
that's what we're saying though.
It's the same as alcohol.
You just do that once. That's it. You don't have the choice beyond that point.
The doors,
it's
not all.
That one time.
Some have gone out and been very successful at staying away from drugs, and usually, if they're that ones of people that are not sort of criminally minded in the first place, but their crime is based around their drug addiction, if they get cleaned up, they go out, and you don't see some of these people. They just don't come back. They realize they go, that's it. Not everybody gets caught up in addiction. Not everybody starts taking drugs, and like I said, we take it for very, very different reasons and complicated reasons. Remember, legal drugs, people are addicted to legal drugs as well.
Yeah, tobacco, alcohol, as we say. Yeah.
Aspirins, painkillers. Yeah. They go nag the doctor until they give them medication.
I get told I'm addicted to work. It is part of it, and I have a.
Not anything that I've noticed, Joe. To be honest with you, I've not really noticed that.
But I do get it. I've had friends in the past, that people I have known, people I still know, that have had different addictions. I've known people that have had severe, serious class A heroin addictions. They've robbed off their parents. I've seen people go through cold turkey. I've known people who've died from drug overdoses and such like that. So it's such a difficult subject, and again we could talk about it for ages. I'm conscious I just want to get a couple of quick questions, and then I'm going to come back to you about the drug dogs, because I think that's probably a good place to finish.
Yes.
And actually I'm going to answer this one for you because it's already been done, but somebody asked about if a prisoner is caught with drugs in their possession, or if they're caught with drugs, do they have time added on to their sentence, and what happens? And little G, so little Officer G, Morris, our tour guide down in Shepton, Morris has actually answered. He said they will be placed on the governor's report, and the governor has the choice of dealing with them there and then, or referring it to outside magistrates, and then they obviously have the ability to add extensions to the sentences, or actually ensure that they just stay for slightly longer, because they normally don't stay for their entire sentence.
That's the process down to a T. That's a standardised process across the whole estate.
See, I'm getting good at this. Okay, so drugs come into jail. People have asked, well, how? Somebody did say earlier on, I can't say, I think it was Sue, said, surely with today's technology, you must be able to stop drugs coming into prison. And one of the best methods of detecting drugs coming into jails has to be... wrong picture. You're stood in the way. That's literally...
That's not my interpretation of that you see there. There you go. Yeah. Okay. Drug dogs were introduced to prisons quite a few years ago. I remember when I first joined, we were mostly guard dogs in the high security prisons, but now we have what they call drug detection dogs. They also have explosive detection dogs as well, of course.
Yeah.
But certainly and they are, I mean, we all know they're good. Drug dogs are very, very good. So what they might be is they might be around when the visits are coming in, and people may be asked to stand obviously across sort of what they call the yellow dots, and the dog will travel through them, a bit like at the airport. And they may come up onto the landings, and we might have prisoners locked away and having what they call a bit of a sweep through the prison. And they'll go into individual cells, and the dog will have a sniff. We'll bring the prisoners out of the cell. The dogs will go in, have a sniff around the place, and we take it from that point on. They'll go around all the areas where prisoners may be, but not their cells. So all the common areas like the kitchens, the workshops, down the landings, any place where a prisoner may be trying to hide their drugs away from their own cell. So they obviously don't want to get caught with it in their cells. So yeah, they're brilliant, the dogs. They really, really are.
And yeah, I mean, I'm about to go down and see the team here from Berwyn. So the guys are here from Berwyn. A group of prison officers, the dog officers from Berwyn are here today. They do come in every couple of months and do training sessions. I believe they've got assessments next week. The dogs, not the trainers. Yeah. And they bring a range of dogs. And sometimes we'll have 2 dogs here. Today, I think we've got 4 or 5. But I have been here when there's been as many as 9. And if you're here and you're visiting on a day that they're here, they will absolutely talk to you about how it works. If you're on a tour, you get to see it and stuff like that. So it's just one of those little added advantages if you come on one of the dog training days, which happen every couple of months, like I say. But they are a fantastic tool.
Yeah, they are. And we've introduced all these things. Now, sometimes prisoners will soak a drug in a letter and put it in an envelope, post it in there. And then sometimes it's hard to detect that stuff. So some prisons have turned around to photocopy the letters and give it to the prisoner, because if they got the genuine thing, they don't bother re-soaking it by steaming it. They just strip it off and smoke it, because the drug is in there already for them. So some prisons have what they call photocopy their letters as they come through the door. But dogs, you've got dogs. The big problem in jails, just to finish off with, are drones that are coming in, of course, because when you're bringing a drone into a prison, it's not just a small amount, it's going to be in bulk. They're going to get as much through that window or drop it as much as they can. I've known in some prisons 4 or 5 mobile phones have been brought in, and quite a large amount of drugs. There was a gang of 5, I think, caught in the Midlands. They were literally doing it on a national scale. They were going up to Durham, to Featherstone Prison, to Birmingham Prison. They were going down south, literally going down in a van with the drugs and taking their drones down and doing it. They got caught eventually and got fairly pretty lengthy sentences for that. But drones are difficult because in some prisons, they can access the windows, because not all windows are sealed and barred off the same way as every other prison. Ours was. We had tiny grills in our windows, so that stuff wasn't coming through those windows. But there are other prisons where windows open like that. So remember, at night time, you've got a very, very minimal amount of staff on. You've got the cameras up, but you've got such few staff there. It's very difficult to, if the drones are coming in and the stuff gets into a window and it's gone. Believe me, it doesn't take long to move these drugs around the place.
Yeah, this is the thing, because I think the simple answer here, I think it was Sue that asked earlier, is surely with today's technology, you should be able to stop drugs coming into prison. The reality is, with today's technology, it's just as easy to get drugs into prison, because you can use technology.
And prisoners use technology as well,
do
of course.
that.
Yeah.
And the rule has always been the same. It's always been the same issue, and it's huge in America. Still exactly the same here, but the numbers are smaller. The reality is there is more money in drugs than there is in a budget to fight drugs. Yeah. And it's that straightforward.
If they have letters or birthday cards being sent in, you have to go through all the padding to make sure it's not hidden there. You've also got clothes that may be coming in to a prisoner and different bits and pieces. You've got to go through all the seams and you've got to check it all. They're as inventive as we are as good at stopping a particular one. They're as inventive, if not more inventive, in finding another way to get around it.
It's a budgetary thing. It comes down to drugs are a £1 billion industry, but the money to fight drugs is only 100 million. They're different figures. You can't.
I always say about drugs coming into a country, people must be aware that when they catch a ship and it's got £5 million worth of drugs in it, don't imagine for 1 second that that's the only ship that's coming to these shores. They'll send 5 of these ships on the grounds, that only two of them are going to get through, and they're in the money. Because if it was true that we were catching the drugs coming in, there wouldn't be the amount of drugs on the streets, because most of it's coming from abroad.
I'm conscious that we're
out of time.
We've got well over time. We've got 5 minutes over.
Harriet
is doing the old cutting across her throat. So I'm not sure.
They're sitting down, guys. I have to stand up all the time, and I'm a really old person. I only had white hair since I come working for this guy.
Right. I think next week, now normally we have a little discussion afterwards. We talk about what we're going to do next week and then we post it. I'm going to throw it out there. I'm wondering if next week, because we've been in lockdown, so everyone has felt a little bit like they've been kept inside effectively, not quite jail standard, but kept inside. And there was some comments earlier about children, and you mentioned it earlier. So I'm wondering if next week we talk maybe just a little bit around young offenders and the difference in prison for under 18s, over 18s, and that kind of behavior, because you started your career in effectively what was a Borstal.
Yes, I did, yeah. And even though the adult age was 18 when I started in Borstall's, prisoners, even today, young offenders are still classified if they're under 21 years old.
Well, let's do that. Let's
where adulthood is actually 18 and has been for many years.
Let's pick up next week on young offenders. We'll obviously talk about some crimes that we know have been committed by people that are under 18, and we can talk again about historically how you could be 10 and executed, whereas now it'd be very different.
I can talk about Borstal. So I think it was one of the most effective sentences for young offenders until they changed it in 1981.
Oh, let's leave it there. Let's leave
one of the most
right.
effective sentences.
Let's leave that right there. Right.
But I'll explain why next week, guys.
I am going to just finish this. So thank you very much again for tuning in. Do us a favor, give Officer G a like on one of his social media pages. I've pinned the link up there. I've put the YouTube channel up there as well, the YouTube page as well, the YouTube video, sorry, about the drug taking in prison that Officer G and I did. And again, do share these videos. Please, please, please tell people that we're here. We do this every week at 11 o'clock because we'd really like to get those viewing numbers up. I know we do it live. It's not convenient for everyone, but you should tell your boss you should be allowed 45 minutes off work to be able to watch this educational documentary.
Educational.
And if not, tell Graham because he knows people.
I know people. Come and sort them out.
Yeah. Say goodbye, Officer G.
Do me the odd favor. See you guys. Stay safe. Look forward to seeing you next week.